But libertarianism needs to do more than simply say, this is what our rights are. Because I do think that's important. I'm an individual rights person. I also think libertarians need to take into account what the nature of human flourishing is in order to understand the nature of our rights, why they're essential, and how they contribute to the common good.
Hello, culminators. Thank you for joining us after the summer break. It has been an eventful summer in so many ways that I will not bore you with. And if you follow me on X, you'll probably know about some of them, but you won't know about all of them. And if you don't follow me on X, it's impossible. Of course, you follow me on X. So today we're going to talk to my friend. And after having now, what's the past tense of dive? Dived into, having read large portions of, because I didn't get to finish it yet because it's long. A Life for Liberty, memoir, Randy Barnett's memoir, The Making of an American Originalist. I am more fascinated than ever by this character, who hit it off. We hit it off very quickly, but I didn't realize quite why until I started reading this book. Randy, welcome to the program. How you doing?
Well, thanks for having me. But before we go any farther into the podcast, I want to tell you what a fan I am of all your contributions on the pop culture YouTube channels that I follow.
That's it. Oh yes, you sent me an interesting DM say that you wanted me to share with the Disney crowd, the Valiant Renegade, and I said that's an interesting quarter for this suggestion to come from. Yeah, tell me more.
I watched Valiant Renegade. I watched WDW Pro. I watched Nerderotic. I watch Disparo, he doesn't have guests, so you're not on his podcast. Anybody else? Midnight Edge.
How about the Little Platoon?
No, I haven't watched Little Platoon.
If you want, it's rather long form, but if you want some really classy wordsmanship and really, really inside, and he's a UK guy, so his perspective is a little bit different, and droll. Yeah, interesting.
Well, you've become a superstar on those channels. You're the special guest they bring in for legal advice, and so they rely on you. They take every word you say as gospel.
That's true. They do. I finally found my Kent ITT School of Law, the place where I could be the absolute superstar of legal prognostication.
But enough about you. Let's talk about me.
And that was a reference, of course, to Randy's first law teaching gig, the law school that was down the street from me practically when I was at Northwestern. But so what you don't know about Randy Barnett is that besides attempting gamely to reinvent libertarianism for our time and failing because it's hopeless, but he is really unusual among law professors, and by that I mean the big guns, the guys in the big schools, and the guys who people cite and invite for panels, that kind of thing. He worked for a living. Randy Barnett, after waking up one morning and finding himself in Harvard Law School, which is practically how the book reads. Okay, you're at Chambana, right? You're at Champaign-Urbana, like everyone in Chicagoland. When I was at Northwestern, everyone was from Champaign, had gone to Champaign, and then, was it just kind of good grades? That's good to get good grades, but that you kind of knocked it out of the park on the LSATs.
Right. I was at Northwestern though. I was at the other.
Oh, sorry. You were at the undergraduate. You were not at Chambana.
Right. But I have to say, I always thought that I was going to be at University of Illinois in Champaign, and I got admitted there based on my ACT scores. And that was the only school I applied to because it was the epitome. If you grew up in Illinois, that was the best school I knew about in Illinois. And it was only after I got my LSAT scores, my guidance counselor at TF North in Calumet City sat me down and said, with your SAT scores, you could get into Northwestern. And I said, really, where's that? So it shows you how cloistered I was in Calumet City on the south side of Chicago, that I didn't even know where Northwestern was. It sounded to me like it was somewhere in northwest United States, like Oregon or state of Washington.
Well,
But
right.
it was just in Evanston. So my
It was
best
in the
friend and I
north.
drove.
It was in the
Right.
northwestern corner of where it was when it was named.
Right. So my best friend and I drove up to Northwestern. We saw how beautiful it was, and I applied there as well as Illinois. And Northwestern accepted me and gave me a scholarship that would equalize the different costs between the two schools, and so I went there.
So that helped. You're coming out of what in Harvard they knew what Northwestern was. It's funny because I had a roughly similar situation. I unlike you, had much too much fun in college to do particularly well in my GPA. And so I was applying to a lot of law schools because let's just say that how well I did in statistics is reflected in the fact that I figured, well, I've got a 1 out of 10 chance at any one of these schools, so I'll just apply to 10 of them. Well, guess what? I got into Northwestern. But the only reason I applied there was that a guy who rode the bus with my father said, why doesn't your son apply to Northwestern? And I thought the same exact thing as you. In fact, in those days, this would be 1984, all Northwestern was known for was its football losing streak. That was during the losing streak days.
Right.
But to my good fortune, they've always favored Ivy Leaguers. So I was their best shot that year at getting someone from Princeton.
But I will say that Northwestern was my prime school because I planned to stay in Chicago and be a criminal lawyer there, and so that was my first choice. But once again, this time I did way better on the LSAT than I even did on the SATs, and it was because of that I decided to apply widely to the Harvard, Yale, that sort of thing, and I got accepted everywhere except Yale. And then decided I would go to Harvard. But the main reason is because I planned to spend my whole life in Chicago. I love Chicago. I thought that if I didn't go away if I went away to school, then and I spent the rest of my life in Chicago, it would be a choice that I made. I would choose to live in Chicago rather than inertia that kept me there. And so I went to Northwestern, but I did come back to Chicago, where I was a criminal prosecutor in the Cook County State's Attorney's Office after I graduated.
And I want to talk about that, but first I want to actually rewind a little bit more. You're also unusual, besides having been a prosecutor among law professors, in that you come from a background a lot like mine. Your parents were not academics. They were not college graduates.
Correct.
I'll never forget, we'll talk about me another second here. When I was at Princeton and I went to RA camp, and this was the beginning of woke mentality. I'm talking about 83, 84. And we had a lady dean, Ada Brown, who was trying to give us a sense of how it feels to be the othered. So she did this thing where everyone was supposed to go out we went out to a field, and she would call out different sort of combinations, and people had to go stand in different circles based. And so she said, if both your parents went to college, go here. And if one of your parents went to college, go to here. And if one of your parents went to Princeton, and the whole idea was to make people understand how the world sees you. And she went through all these things. She said, "See, have you all learned a great lesson?" I said, "Hold on a second. I'm standing there with one other person." I said, "You didn't say, what if neither one of your parents went to college?" She had proved her whole hypothesis by not even considering the possibility that someone could be here and neither of their parents had gone to college.
That's great. That's a great story.
So it is. You had this working class background. My dad was a payroll and benefits clerk in an architecture firm, grew up on the Lower East Side. Your dad was a real nuts and bolts kind of guy.
Yeah, well, he owned a laundry. He said with his dad before his dad passed away when I was 1 month old. So he had a laundry. It was a pretty hard work. I used to work for him, and then on weekends he would do automobile tune-ups. He was a tune-up specialist. So during the week he worked very late hours, long hours at the laundry, and on the weekends he would work at my uncle's garage on our block, tuning up cars.
He taught you to be inquisitive and kind of take a hard-boiled look at assuming things and believing things. Is that
Well, he was a natural contrarian, so which I didn't know what that meant, and neither did he, until I was much older, and I realized that's kind of what I am, and it's sort of what he was. And I went and told him this while he was still alive, that I thought, it turns out you're kind of a contrarian. He kind of took it as an insult because it seems like you're a negative person. He was not a negative person, neither am I, but we tend to. He always looked for what he thought was the right answer, not the answer that the group decided was the right answer. So with respect to automobiles, for example, in those days, there were Chevy families. They were most numerous. They were Ford families. Well, naturally, we were a Chrysler family because Chrysler had the best powertrains, even though their bodies rusted out more, my dad would admit. For hamburgers, McDonald's was the most popular. Burger King came in. It was the second most popular. We were fans in our family of something called Prince Castle, which you've never heard of. It was a Midwestern chain. I have no idea why he thought that was better than the other ones, but that's what we liked. So it was like that for everything. But he always had a reason. He always had a reason why he thought the thing that other people didn't prefer was correct. And that impressed me. Even when he didn't give a reason, I always knew he had a reason. And so he and I reasoned together. He didn't have that much interest in my brother and me until we were old enough to reason with him. And then we became very close to him. I mean, he loved us, and my nickname for him when I was 3 years old was Most Man, 2 years old,
Yeah.
because he was so masculine. He was an alpha male for sure. And I always tried to emulate him,
But
even though I biologically probably take more after my mom. I always tried to emulate my dad.
well, again, same with me. I'm my mother's son, but my dad was my dad, and that's, I think, the healthiest possible outcome, regardless of what your phenotype is. If a boy should look up to his dad, and it seems like your father was cerebrally driven. If not, he was obviously not an intellectual, but as you say,
Absolutely.
he got interested in having you guys around when you could share thoughts, when you could become part of the world of, thought and speech and all the things that come with it.
He was cerebral. I've never really thought about that word. It's absolutely apt. He was cerebral, no question about it. And that he definitely imparted that on me, which also kind of makes you an odd person out with other kids, because other kids are into sports and statistics and baseball stats and all this kind of stuff. But thanks to my dad, or maybe thanks to my nature, I was cerebral as well, and that kind of I was always thinking about things. As you'll see in the book, I was starting newspapers repeatedly, and thinking about ideas. I debated on behalf of Barry Goldwater in front of my entire junior high school and grade school student body when I was 12 years old in 1964.
Can you imagine? It was so. I had the same exact experience, but I was stuck with Gerald Ford.
Poor you. Poor you. I think I would have taken a pass if I were you.
Well,
In my heart,
you knew you were right.
In my heart, I knew he was right.
But in my heart, I knew Jimmy Carter was wrong, and I was also only 12 years old.
So one of the cool things about this book is I've been schlepping boxes of papers and mementos from basement to basement for 40 or 50 years, never knowing what they would be good for. It would always seem like kind of a waste of space. But when I wrote this memoir, I was able to go back and mine all of these documents I have to establish my memories. For example, I actually have my handwritten debate notes for that debate when I was 12, including the summation I delivered at the end. So I could actually quote my 12-year-old self from 1964.
That's a pretty unusual thing for a kid to not only do, but to keep. That is kind of unusual. But I didn't have the impression, even though you did the newspaper stuff, that you were a nerdy kid. Am I wrong?
I think I was was a nerdy kid who didn't want to be a nerdy kid. This really,
You
I
did
wish I had.
you did slug a couple of guys who had it
I
coming,
did.
and
I
one
did.
guy
And
also slugged the hell out of you
that's true.
at that party.
I mean, I do talk about the fights that I had in the book. The first one was when I was in second grade. I should mention Calumet City was a predominantly Polish Catholic town, but a lot of Protestants lived on our side of town. No Jews. In my graduating class of 400 in high school, we had 4 Jews, one of whom became my best friend.
You have to
Eventually.
know the difference between the Jewish spelling and the Lithuanian spelling.
Yes, yes, yes. So when I was in second grade, a kid on the playground called me a dirty Jew, and I hit him, and we got into this fist fight, and we both were punished for fighting. But it didn't strike me until I was, fully grown that the kid probably had no way of knowing I was Jewish. I don't have Barnett is not a Jewish name. I didn't really look stereotypically Jewish. I think he might have just insulted me without realizing I actually was Jewish. So I vowed at that point that I was going to fight anybody who insulted me because I was a Jew. And then as I got bigger and the bad guys got bigger, that guy, by the way, turned into a real juvenile delinquent. But as the bad guys got bigger and I didn't get that much bigger, I decided to modify my policy of fighting everybody, and then I tried to avoid fights unless they were unavoidable. And I talk about my unavoidable fights. The last one couldn't even be described as a fight. I was leaving. I was a freshman in college and went back to Calumet City. I was leaving a party with a pretty girl who was interested in me, which is not something that always happened to me. And as I got to the doorway of this back family room, going outside, all I remember seeing were the street light from the alley reflecting off the shoulders of somebody. And the next thing I knew, I was lying on my back, flat on my back in the middle of the room, because that was her brother who had come and he gotten a phone call about this party, and he saw me leaving with his sister, and it just was one punch to the face, took 4 stitches to close it. And he knocked me so far back with one punch into the room that my shoe was at the doorway. He knocked me out of my shoe. So 4 of my friends, including my best friend, my Jewish friend, jumped on top of this guy to pull him off. It took at first he was shedding people like this. And then eventually, and I was in a fetal position. And so then eventually they pulled him off of me, put me to, I was in shock, took me to the doorway, handed me my shoe, and told me to get out of there, which I did. I had to run all the way. They pointed me in the wrong direction. I had to run around the alley all the way in the wrong direction to get home, walk into my parents' house covered with blood. And they took me to the hospital where I got my stitches. So that was my last fight,
But what did that
which
teach
doesn't
you?
even,
What is? I
doesn't
mean,
even,
there's something. I had 1 or 2 fights. That was it. But once you fight back, you're a different person in the neighborhood. You're a
yeah.
completely different creature.
Well, the other thing that you learn is that in all the fights I got into, again, there weren't that many. I talk about them in the book and what provoked them. What I learned is you don't actually feel the blows while you're in the middle of a fight. You'll feel them later. But you go into this state in which you kind of don't feel it. And that's not something. And so you sort of become less afraid of doing it, knowing that, it's not as terrifying as you imagine it's going to be before it happens to you.
But there's a metaphor here for being pugnacious, for not being afraid of mixing it up and taking positions that don't necessarily endear you to those around you, which was a quality that you, as you mentioned, you had already learned from your father.
And my father also, I should mention, was also a street fighting Jew on the South, in South Shore, in the actual city of Chicago. And he was a tough guy, and
You had to be.
and I would just, as my friend Jay says, I quoted him, my best friend Jay from high school said, when I quote him in the book, he said, you were never a tough guy, but you never back down. And that's kind of, I think, how I've modeled my academic career.
I would say so. Based on what you've written, that's the impression I have, which definitely cost you.
Well,
It's a
it
two-way
did for a
street.
while, but I think that in the end, it's benefited me because academia, if you can stick it out, and if you're any good, you could ultimately get rewarded for your uniqueness, whereas almost everybody else is kind of repeating versions of the same thing.
Well,
And I just found out last week that the most recent survey of the citations to constitutional law professors put me number 11. And over the last 5 years, I'm the 11th most cited law professor. And people get cited because of something they say that's different than what other people say. I also have the dream job I always aspired to at Georgetown. I've argued in front of the Supreme Court. I've been a actor in a movie, a science fiction movie portraying a prosecutor filmed
although
in
not
LA.
not the screenwriter you also hope to be.
And right, well, they changed some of my edits to the script, if that's what you mean.
Yeah.
Although some of them stayed in there. The tagline for the movie stayed in. I didn't realize that till the movie came out. It was called Inalienable, and it was about an alien. And I inserted some dialogue in the script that they used as the tagline for the movie, and that is even aliens have inalienable rights. But
So,
I had a great time filming that movie. I have a whole chapter on that movie, as well as a chapter on the connection I eventually made with James Garner, who was one of my television heroes as Maverick in Rockford Files.
well, you seem to have had a good time in general.
I
It
have.
is, I think you have. I get that impression. So you say, okay, I'm going to go to Harvard. This is going to be, it's going to, this, and one of the things I enjoyed about the book is you write really guilelessly about your ambition. You don't apologize for wanting to be in a better law school or wanting to be in a, go to a better law school, teach in a better law school. You're telling it like it is. You're not being apologetic about it. I'm going to have more opportunities if I do this. It's a fascinating study of the strategy of how to, and again, I think, again, this was something I related to. When you don't come into the world with the kind of network that a lot of the people we encountered in school had, social networks and professional networks, you come up with strategies to differentiate yourself and to find openings. So you started writing about and teaching things that other people weren't necessarily interested in, and becoming, the expert on forgotten amendments, until you
Correct.
eventually found yourself. And you actually, as you point out, you didn't ever think of yourself until you did, as a con law guy.
Right. As a contracts person.
But contracts, well, of course, because you had been a prosecutor. What could be more logical?
Well,
Okay.
actually, I was looking. I had thought and breathed nothing but criminal law since I was 10 years old, and a television show came on TV on CBS called The Defenders,
The defenders.
starring E.G. Marshall and Robert Reed, and that's what gave me the idea that I wanted to be a criminal lawyer, eventually a prosecutor, not a defense attorney, but I could have gone either way. But that was my passion. That was the only thing I wanted to do. And all the people, at Harvard Law School, like they are today, they said, don't you think you're going to waste your degree? Don't you want to clerk and work for a big firm? Actually, I don't even know if they mentioned clerking. I don't know if I knew what clerking was. But I said, no, I didn't go to Harvard Law School so I could do something I didn't want to do. I went there so I could do something I do want to do and what I want to be as a criminal lawyer. But by the time I had done that for 4 years and relished it, it was amazing. It was all consuming. I was a little bored with the subject. Frankly, I was more of a what you might call a skeptic of criminal law, whereas I would prefer to teach something I'm for rather than teach something I'm against. I'm for the Constitution. I'm for contracts. I'm for freedom of contract. On criminal law, I had some doubts. And besides, I thought I had written already about the theory of criminal law. I didn't have more to say about that. Contracts was kind of a big open territory because I'd had a very left-wing contracts professor in Harvard who was also very good. And I couldn't respond to him as a student. And I thought, well, maybe responding to him as an academic would get me somewhere and I'd make some progress. And I also was kind of interested in developing something like a libertarian code of justice, and contract law would be a very important part of that.
Okay, so explain, as you do in the book, how libertarianism pops in, becomes this defining ideology or philosophy of your life.
Right. Well, I was always big on liberty. My first publication is in my grade school newspaper, which I reproduced an image of in the book, where I talk about liberty and how we don't take liberty. We take liberty for granted, and George Washington appreciated liberty, and we need to pay more attention to liberty. This is when I was, 8 years old or 9 years old. I wrote that. Um,
Bootlicker.
huh?
You're a bootlicker.
I don't even know. What do you mean?
You're a statist.
I'm a statist because I want liberty?
Yeah, because you associated it with George Washington. He didn't invent liberty.
No, well, look, come on,
You're
that's
a
my
kid.
8-year-old self, right? I could
Exactly.
you just plug in James Madison. So, at any rate, I was a conservative. You might call me a William F. Buckley kind of conservative, and I watched Firing Line, for example, on TV. Saw Buckley do that. But it was always, there's different kinds of conservatives. There's kind of liberty-based conservatives, and then there are tradition-based conservatives or religious conservatives. And I was definitely a liberty type conservative. And it wasn't until I got to college, and then I discovered philosophy, which I didn't know, I had never heard of as a high school student, and discovered, since my passion, I said my sort of the unifying principle of everything I've ever done is my desire to see justice done, whatever justice might be. What I didn't realize is when I got to college is there's actually a field of inquiry that studies what justice is. So I switched my major immediately from political science to philosophy, and then became an adherent of natural law. I became a protege of a distinguished senior professor at Northwestern named Henry Veach, who was a preeminent Aristotelian Thomist philosopher. I still am an Aristotelian Thomist myself because of his influence. And then it was after that that I discovered what libertarianism was when I was a junior, because of a classmate of mine who tried to tell me about it. And because I heard the word, I thought the word sounded weird. I didn't want her to tell me any more about it. But she eventually brought a speaker, a libertarian junior professor from Northwestern, to our residential college. He gave a lecture on libertarianism. And I thought to myself, aha, this is what I've been looking for. This is a rational conservatism. And then over a period of months, I would get together and discuss this with him. And eventually I decided, well, maybe I'm not a conservative. Maybe I'm a libertarian. The next book I want to write is going to be about how libertarianism needs to be updated. And once again, I think I'm going to make the claim that libertarianism is a rational conservatism, that conservatives who are liberty-based conservatives, they basically lack their own theory. And a properly reframed libertarianism, not the one that I was participated in developing in the 70s and the 80s, but a properly updated libertarianism should appeal to a lot of people who think of themselves as conservatives today. But that's my next project. That's not this one. Although I do describe it a little bit at the end of this book.
And it is intriguing because it needs updating and it needs clarification. And I'm not the authority on that, especially because I'm probably more of a conservative than a libertarian myself. But it wasn't until college that I encountered it either, libertarianism. Hadn't ever really heard of it.
So after I discovered libertarianism as a junior, by my senior year, I taught an accredited seminar at Northwestern, a student organized seminar on libertarianism. Then I went to college, and through a series of happenstances that I won't that are in the book, I ended up getting to know Murray Rothbard, a preeminent New York intellectual libertarian, and all the other New York libertarians. And they invited
in law
me.
school, right? In law school.
My first year of law school, and by my second semester, I met them my first semester. By my second semester, they invited me to be on the board of directors of the Center for Libertarian Studies in New York, which also and one of our principal activities were to have an annual Libertarian Scholars Conference, as well as publish a Journal of Libertarian Studies. So
Now,
I was
didn't you
spending a
know you
lot.
were supposed to, wait a minute, you were supposed to do law review.
I
That's the
know,
track to success and glory.
right?
What are you
I
doing
couldn't
doing things outside of the framework?
in New York. I would spend a lot of time on Amtrak getting down to New York to meet for the board meetings. I didn't understand why anybody would want to do law review. It just seemed like a bunch of scut work that you didn't get paid for. I didn't understand it because nobody had explained to me the stepping stones to other things. I've also didn't need it to be a criminal lawyer in Chicago, which was my career objective. However, I also had in the back of my mind that I wanted to be a law professor. I used to tell the story that this hit me halfway through law school. In fact, in writing the book, I found my law school applications, and I say right in my law school application to Harvard and the other schools I applied to that I might want to be a law professor one day and teach jurisprudence because I was interested in philosophy. So I already had this in my mind. What nobody told me is how you get a job like that. And it turns out everything I did is the wrong way to get a teaching job.
And yet, meanwhile, you're developing this alternate track, this intellectual movement. You're part of a handful of people whose names redound. Do I mean redound?
Redound, redound. Yeah.
To this day,
Yeah.
in libertarian and conservative and federalist society lore. And that's not something law students usually do.
I knew Robert Nozick, for example. He was a great guy. He was very nice to me, as well as all the other libertarian superstars. I once saw Hayek. I was at a conference with Hayek. I was on a tour boat with him. I took a picture of him. That picture I took is in the book. I didn't actually talk to Hayek because I didn't have anything to say to him other than, "Hi, you're Friedrich Hayek." But I admired him.
You could have been a New Yorker with that attitude.
Now, don't insult me. I didn't come here to be insulted. I'm a Chicagoan. I'm a Chicago boy. So I was intimately involved in the developing of this model. I didn't start it myself, but I joined it while it was at its formative stage. The problem with the intellectual model, in my view, which I've written about this on the Law and Liberty website in an essay called Libertarianism Updated, is that unlike originalism, which has spent 20 or 30 years debating the merits of originalism within the movement. That is, originalists have been doing battle with each other, and thereby the model keeps getting refined and improved over time. Libertarianism stopped developing in about the 1980s because there was unlike originalism, which has the Federalist Society as an intellectual infrastructure within which these debates can happen. Libertarianism lost its infrastructure when the Center for Libertarian Studies went away. And so debate stopped. You had opinion magazines like Reason Magazine and others, policy institutes like the Cato Institute, but no intellectual hotbed in which libertarians were going to be debating theory with each other. And so as a result, it got stultified, it got stunted, it got frozen in amber, and it needs to be updated to respond to today, to the problems we face today, and the stresses that puts on the model that libertarianism presented. I think it requires modification of the model.
Would you agree that one of the challenges to libertarianism is Brol Libertarianism?
What's that?
Joe Rogan Libertarianism. In other words, a sort of not particularly intellectual affiliation with libertarianism that is really premised on drugs and a kind of a hipster, I just want to be left alone. In other words, not let's grapple with what's really going to work for society. I mean, obviously there's a libertarian retort to that. It's not my business what happens. But
I now I understand what you're saying, and I think that's part of what I talk about in that essay. First of all, for many libertarians, it's just a series of policies that they favor, and the degree to which you're a libertarian is the degree to which you favor those individual policies. Well, not all those individual policies, I think, are entirely warranted on libertarian grounds. But libertarianism.
What's an example?
Well, I would say, open borders. There are many libertarians associated with the Cato Institute who I've had a long and friendly relationship with over the years, who are for open borders, and I think that open borders don't work in a world that we live in now. Why they don't work, exactly why they don't work, and exactly what should happen is something that I want to develop. I gave a speech about this before COVID, which is going to be a chapter of the book when I build it out, called "A Libertarian Take on Nationalism." But there's some fundamental theoretical drawbacks to the way libertarians have approached these things. And I don't mind popular libertarians like Joe Rogan or people who think of themselves that way. But libertarianism needs to do more than simply say, this is what our rights are. Because I do think that's important. I'm an individual rights person. I also think libertarians need to take into account what the nature of human flourishing is in order to understand the nature of our rights, why they're essential, and how they contribute to the common good. And so I've written about that lately as well. I've written about that even not so lately about the good society. And so I do think I think what conservatives need, conservatives like your professor, Marty Reddish, who I've known for many years, what conservatives need
Is he a
is
conservative?
natural.
Is he a conservative? Is that what we
Well,
call him?
he's a kind of a conservative. Well,
He's a
he's a judicial conservative.
yeah. That's
What
fair
can
enough.
all right, so strike Marty Reddish, but what conservatives need, and I think Marty needs it too, is natural rights. And what libertarians need is natural law ethics. They avoid the idea of discussing what the good is, but I think that's something that libertarians need to grapple with. And I do think that at the end of the day, and my professor Henry Veach, who was a natural law, he was a liberal Democrat, a natural law person. A lot of natural law people are hostile to natural rights, which
So
they
you got to
consider.
stop now because I read your book and I took one philosophy course in college. HLA Hart. It wasn't from him. It was from a guy named James Ward Smith, but he dropped Hart on us, of course. But explain this distinction to the ColemanNation world between natural law and natural rights, because they are not the same.
They're not the same. And before I say the distinction, let me just say I finish the previous thought, which is that his natural law is a much older subject, and many people who are natural law people are hostile or to natural rights. They view that as kind of an enlightenment deviation from the true path. My professor was in that category, but it wasn't. But near the end of his life, in 1987, he published a book called Human Rights, Fact and Fancy, in which he gave a natural law defense of natural rights. So he came around to the view, even though it was not under my influence. I was very glad to see it. I recommend his book, Human Rights, Fact or Fancy by Henry Veach, Veatch. But at any rate, okay, I'm delighted to talk about the difference, what they are. They're both grounded in the same methodology. They're both attempting to find a normative ought from the nature of human beings and the world in which we find ourselves. They are both normative disciplines. Descriptive disciplines are like physics, biology, geography. These are all descriptive disciplines. They're trying to describe the world. Natural law is part of ethics, which is a normative discipline trying to discover how people ought to act. So natural law ethics is the subject of how people ought to live their life in order to, or another way of putting it, if you're an Aristotelian, is to pursue the good life and to flourish. Of course, you have to understand what the nature of human beings are to figure out what's good for them, just as you have to understand what the nature of an acorn is, which is to grow into an oak tree, to know what's good for an acorn. What's good for an acorn is sun and nourishment and water. What's good for human beings, given the nature, are other things. Basically, the bottom line here is that virtues are the things that are good for human beings, and vices are the things that are bad for human beings. And that's what natural law ethics is. Natural rights is about a different subject. It's not about how we live our life. It's about how society should be structured to allow people to pursue the good life. So natural rights define the boundaries within which each of us should be free to pursue the good life, to follow the natural law. That's the relationship between the two. One is is about ethics. It's about how we ought to behave. The other is about society and how it ought to be structured. Now, libertarians have confined themselves to the second of these questions, the political question, which is separable. You can separate it for purposes of analysis, and we should, but it's not disconnected entirely from the first of these things, which is what libertarians have eschewed over the years. Not all, but that's the model that has basically been received by what you're calling the Libertarian Bros. And I
And
think that needs to be updated.
yeah, and because they're both premised on the idea that there's such a thing called good. Not that I can necessarily impose it on you, but that it's an inquiry that we ought to make. And I think part of where we are now in, again, popular libertarianism is there is an attraction for nihilism that, again, there's a difference between saying, I should not have to justify myself to you, and saying I shouldn't have to justify myself to myself or to anyone.
Well,
or to,
I get that. In fairness to the libertarians that I learned from and was part of in the 70s and 80s, we used to make fun of the other libertarians who claimed that that you should live liberty. That's what they claimed. That's not what we thought. What's living liberty? Living liberty is breaking the drug laws, for example. That's living liberty. You know, you should. So these are the people you're talking about. That existed then. But our group, we didn't have that view. Murray Rothbard was an Aristotelian as well. In fact, I'm the one that introduced him to Henry Veitch's writings, and Henry became associated with some of those institutions because of I connected them up. He didn't know about Henry, and Henry didn't know about Murray. So I think the seeds of what I'm talking about were there, but I believe the living liberty people, have gone on. I think that's who you're talking about, and they don't speak for me, and so I think it's time to do this. But again, this is my next project. It's not this project, but here's what I will say about my book for those of you who we haven't lost by now with this discussion.
We're not only not losing them, people are stopping the recording and bringing family members in.
Well, here's the thing about the book. I teach everything we've talked about, Ron. I try to teach in the book by means of telling the story of how I discovered them myself. So you're following my intellectual development, but I'm informing you about what that intellectual development consisted of. And that also includes my intellectual development as an originalist and then as a constitutional litigator, litigating the medical marijuana case out of California, the Raich case, and devising the theory that as to why the individual insurance mandate in Obamacare was unconstitutional. I came up with that theory. And the book begins with the Raich case, and near the end, I talk about the Obamacare case, and then I inform the reader about how I came up with these ideas, so the reader can discover them right along with me. And when you're done with this, you'll actually have a little short course on the Commerce Clause and the Necessary and Proper Clause, which is the clauses that were at issue in both of these very, very famous high-profile cases that every law student now studies in constitutional law.
And I think you do it. I think you do it very effectively. It really is very approachable. It's really rather short on jargon, considering the pitfalls, the possibilities here, because you really do approach it in a way. It almost seems to me as if you're writing for your dad.
Well, I'm right. Yes, I thank you, but I am sort of writing for him. I mean, in his memory, he was. I think I even dedicate the book to him. I try to remember now. I mean, I think I might. I have a copy of the book here. No, I dedicated it to my grandchildren, and then all those who mentioned here who made mine a life worth living. It was having my first grandchild 8 years ago that gave me the idea to write a memoir for the benefit of my grandchildren who would never know these stories from me directly. But then it grew into a tribute to my mentors, starting first and foremost with my dad.
Now, you mentioned actually along the way that I'm not sure I got exactly what the parameters were. It's the first memoir by a law professor, or is that really?
As far as I know, it's unusual to have memoirs. Anybody, get a memoir published is very difficult. I didn't think I'd get this one published.
That's right. There might be lots of people who wrote.
Right. But I don't know of another memoir by a law professor, although after I wrote that, Mary Ann Glendon published a book that talked about her experience working within the administration of the Catholic Church, which I haven't read, but which when I listened to a podcast with her, it sounded like that was kind of a memoir of hers. And her book came out slightly before mine, but I didn't know about it when I said I was the only law professor who'd written a memoir, who had it published.
What would you do differently? You pursued so many paths, as I said before, in unconventional ways. And as you said, you end up really in the place that even if you had not known then that it was where you'd want to be. And it's interesting how many times you say, I never really appreciated that it was Georgetown, that I was really meant to be at. What would you have done differently to fine tune things, to make it a little bit easier, to not maybe, besides wasting time with the Northwestern faculty, that kind of thing, which is part of the learning experience.
That's
also
an allusion to the 2 times they turned me down for a job in 2 different humiliating ways, or painful ways, I should say. The first time the faculty turned me down. The second time the faculty unanimously voted to make me an offer, and the dean would refuse to give me the offer at Northwestern. So I had 2 strikes at Northwestern. But I would say the second that faculty vote is what put me on the radar at Georgetown, and so I ultimately ended up getting a better job than I would have gotten if Northwestern had hired me. But funny, I haven't really thought about that question, and I've done maybe 10 podcasts, and no one's ever asked me that, what I would do differently, Ron. And thinking back off the top of my head, the one regret that I actually call a rare regret in the title of the chapter is when this beautiful German foreign exchange student asked a mutual friend if she could ask me to the girls' ask boy dance that we would have in my senior year. And I went with her, and she really liked me, and I went out with her a couple times, and then for some reason I decided not to ask her out anymore. I can't explain it. It was like because she liked me, therefore that's why I didn't like her, whatever it was. And if I had it to do all over again, I would not have stopped calling her, and I would have had somebody to take to the prom, which I didn't attend because I had no one to go to the prom with. And I could have had a beautiful, intelligent girlfriend my entire senior year, but instead I got my first girlfriend when I was in college. But so
You see, Culminators, the unexamined life is the only one worth living.
I regret that was a big mistake, but I learned my lesson. I tell that story in the book because I didn't make the same mistake when I met my wife.
No, and it was, and you, it is a very sweet story of your courtship with your wife, and believe it or not, we're 50 minutes in, and the 3 of us who were still, you and me and whoever else is, the last remaining person. Randy, it zoomed right by. Folks, I tried to visit Randy when I was in the Washington area a couple of weeks ago, and it's not even worth telling you how that fell through. But the book is so readable. But again, it just hit so many notes with me. It's been great getting to know you, and the getting to know you through the book. And again, I really appreciated my wife. I show my wife the book. She says, "Well, he brags a lot." No, it's not. He's just telling you, and it's funny because she's married to me. Like, I don't pull any punches about what I think I know what I can't do very well, but I know what I can do. I was in court yesterday in the Northern District of Georgia. I was awesome. I absolutely brought it. In any event, Randy, everybody, by all means, it is a very accessible book. And if you're interested, and it's also true what Randy says, you learn about these ideas, and you learn about, you hear about the Federalist Society. These are people who have really shaped and are still shaping. Randy, you're incredibly old, and yet you're still talking about the next book and the book after that. Keep on keeping on. Fantastic. Loved hanging out with you. You got one more thought.
One more thought. We talked about the book covers my being a libertarian, the natural law person. The book talks about originalism and how I became an originalist. And it also talks about being Jewish and how that figured into everything. And at the end, the last chapter is what's the future for libertarianism, what's the future for originalism, and what's the future for Judaism, which is a big problem because that chapter was written after October 7th. So that my experience as a Jew growing up in a Christian town, also going to synagogue with a bunch of liberal Jews who looked down their noses at people from Calumet City, that all was a very important part of my growing up. And I just wanted to add that. And thanks very much for the very kind things that you've said about the book, Ron. I really appreciate it. I'm sorry we couldn't have you out to the lake when you were here in town. But let me know when you're going to be. Let me know when you're back.
No, and we maybe we'll do a whole episode one of these days talking about those 3 questions together, because one of the questions I wanted to ask you, and I was afraid it would just get us completely off the rails, was where does God fit into this? Where and you began to also allude to it. The Jewish problem is nation, religion, style. What is it? Because those things are all in, we're facing challenges. My parents didn't have to be observant to know that even if they might date a German exchange student for the prom. They were going to marry a Jewish girl. That was understood. It might have been understood because of prejudice. It might have been understood because, but those barriers are gone. Those natural inclinations, those connections are gone now. And I'd love to hear from you, and it's not going to be today, why it matters to you, that they not be gone. Randy,
Right.
thanks again. We'll talk soon.
Thanks, Ron. Thanks for having me. I really appreciate it.